to our CUNY School of Public Health Grand Rounds lecture, this one co-sponsored by the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. I'm Nick Freudenberg. I teach public health at the CUNY School of Public Health, and I'm also the director of the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute. And we're just so pleased to have all of you joining us for this session. We're delighted to have today Dr. Ashante Reese, who is going to be giving the talk today. Dr. Reese works at the intersection of critical food studies and Black geographies, studying the ways that Black people produce and navigate food-related spaces and places in the context of systemic racism and anti-Blackness. The questions she asks are who and what survives in this system, and much of her work has focused on the everyday strategies that Black people use to navigate inequity and find food that is healthy, delicious, and appealing. Her book, Black Food Geographies, Race, Self-Reliance, and Food Access in Washington, D.C., looks at some of these themes through ethnographic studies in the nation's capital. And it won the 2020 Best Monograph Award from the Association for the Study of Food and Society. Her second book, Black Food Matters, Racial Justice in the Wake of Food Justice, is a collection co-edited with Hannah Garth that explores the geographic, social, and cultural dimensions of food in Black life across the country. And currently, Dr. Reese is working on a new project that explores the continuity of plantation geographies and abolitionist possibilities within rural and urban food systems, looking at the agribusiness sector of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And her appointment is at the University of Texas in Austin. And Ashante, we're so pleased to have you here today, and I turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Freudenberg, for that introduction. Also, thank you for the invitation. I was really thrilled to receive this invitation. Thank you, Paulo, for the administrative support, answering all my questions, making sure I have the right Zoom link, and that I show up at the right time, because now that I'm on Central Time again, I am always messing up the time zones. So thank you for sending me the necessary calendar invites to make sure that I was showing up on time and not an hour off. So you see the title of my talk on the screen, which I'll give in a second. I just want to give a preface to say that the thoughts that I'm working out here are thoughts I've been mulling around for maybe the last 3 or 4 months. And so I welcome feedback here. And I subtitled this Notes on Delight, Food, and the Black Radical Imagination, because I really do consider them notes. I think of notes and I think of thoughts in process and in progress. So so that's an invitation to think alongside me and to ask questions when it's appropriate. So let's get started. When I first started this work as a graduate student over 10 years ago, I was inspired to do it because of the 7th graders I taught in Atlanta, Georgia. If you've had a chance or you intend to read Black Food Geographies, then you know the story, so I won't completely rehash it here, but there are questions about difference in my neighborhood grocery stores, and theirs became my own questions. I loved those students who are now adults. Increasing access to healthy food was one way for me to demonstrate that love. And in some ways, at the time, it felt like enough. The immediate need for my 12 and 13-year-old students was more options and to have more choice. I was deeply invested in thinking about childhood obesity at the time, in part sparked by one of my students who was a type 2 diabetic, something that I didn't even know could impact children at her age. I did not think this was her fault, but I did wonder if the neighborhood environment had anything to do with it. I'm sure there were other influences that I don't or can't name now, but teaching middle school in a highly segregated city with a stable and thriving Black and upper middle class community and leadership drew me into questions about race, space, and food. Black food geographies became something that I did not plan. I presume this is true of a lot of the research that many of us do. If we were in the same room together, I imagine a lot of people would be nodding right now. In the early formations of the work, I had planned to think quite explicitly about what people were eating. I had planned to spend more time in people's kitchens, on shopping trips with them, at their dining room tables. In essence, I was interested in trying to think across spatial registers. What connected the kitchen, the dining table, the grocery store, and the neighborhood? What dissonance did these distinct spaces produce when they were thought together? Maybe this is still a project for someone, and if you are looking for one, you're welcome. But my project changed quite a bit in the first 4 months of fieldwork, and even more so as I read more widely outside of food studies. In the first 4 months, when I abandoned asking too many questions in favor of just being around and just listening, themes of self-reliance emerged without me prompting. That, alongside a growing, discomforting reality that many of the people I encountered thought that I was there to tell them what to eat or to evaluate their eating, led me away from the plate and more toward thinking about race and spatial politics in a different way, one that was built around the concept of navigating. I very much like the idea of thinking about residents' movement through and creation of space and place, and self-reliance became something like a compass that many of the residents had access to. When I look back to my earliest thinkings on access, it was a social justice imperative, but it wasn't one that I had intentionally connected to larger freedom dreams. Lately, I've been thinking about what it means to think and write beyond access as a framework. I have in the past shied away from questions that ask about solutions or answers to the problem. And maybe I'm actually selling myself short here because I feel I was making an intentional and willful set of refusals. I have no interest in creating or mimicking prescriptive answers that were conjured in closed rooms and meetings that do not include the theories, perspectives, experiences, or voices of people that I care about. In some ways, I never forgot the fact that no one asked my seventh grade students what they thought about food, taste, or much of anything. My refusal was a reflection of commitment to co-thinking, co-dreaming, and co-creating. But what I've been thinking about and learning in my most recent years is that even if that is true, I needed to do some soul searching on my own and some unlearning to free my own limited imagination, or at least to bind the food futures that I want to see more formally to Black freedom dreams. A couple of years ago, when my book was in press, not yet been published, a mentor said to me, "Every book has its own failure, and that failure is an opportunity." I understood her words to be a critique of perfectionism, but also an invitation to be thoughtful about opening up to the idea that I might find something within my own work as a failure or an opportunity that would open up for further possibilities for theorizing, acting, and being. Her words are with me daily now as I've had time to think about what I love about Black food geographies and what opportunities it affords me for further thinking and expansion. What I now see as a failure, read opportunity, is the centrality of access in my own framing and thinking. So I want to pause here just to say that I'm not suggesting that I'm against creative or thoughtful planning for making food more easily accessible or bountiful in a nation where that could be easily done if profit were not such a driving factor. Given the role that neighborhood composition and residential segregation play and where businesses, food or otherwise, are located, however, conversations about access can easily and dangerously become flattened and conflated, like in my earlier thinking about my students, with conversations about health and well-being and choice. In her groundbreaking work that I continue to return to, Julie Guthman pushes back against this, arguing that while emphasis on the built environment is meant to shift us away from individual responsibility, it can have the opposite impact by, quote, implicitly assuming that the environment simply acts on people, so that people are objects, not agents in their own environments, end quote. Since neighborhoods with poor food access reflect race and class dynamics that exceed food and supermarkets, presuming that if we build it, they will come runs the risk of not only treating people as movable objects, but also further stigmatizing and alienating them if they don't choose what was newly added to their neighborhood, even if it will presumably make them healthier. The built environment is important, and we know this, but we also know that all environments are co-created and co-constituted by their use and their non-use. This is one of the points I wanted to get across in Black food geographies, that residents are using, navigating, and recreating space and place as they navigate this food environment. Taking these sets of navigations and needs and desires into consideration matters for how we do food justice work. What I'm suggesting here is a pushback against access as a singular or even primary framework through which we understand nourishment, which is one way of saying thinking about nourishment, nourishing lives and not just bodies. Hannah Garth's work has been one of my primary teachers in rethinking nourishment. In her book, Food in Cuba, Garth offers, quote, the politics of adequacy as a theoretical intervention to help us connect the spatial politics of food insecurity to the socio-political context in which it emerges, to the actual desires of those who are navigating that set of insecurities. Of her participants and friends in Santiago, she writes, the insistency on acquiring specific ingredients is part of a refusal to lower their standards for the food they consume and part of their desire to consume what I call a decent meal, which is tightly bound to their sense of a right to a decent life. For those of us who are doing this work, she poses questions that I think are applicable across geographies. What makes a food provisioning system adequate? And adequate to what ends? And to those questions, I would add adequate to whose ends? By complicating adequacy, Garth forces us to question what is it exactly that we are fighting for? Her chapter in our co-edited volume, Black Food Matters, makes this conundrum quite clear. In the chapter, she opens with a story about working with an LA-based food justice organization that worked primarily with Black and Latinx children in South and East LA. When participating in an event and asked about her favorite food, Hannah responded macaroni and cheese, much to the chagrin of the two leaders of the organization. Though Hannah offered a true answer and a culturally relevant favorite food in line with what the kids offered, one of the organization leaders pulled her aside after to say, quote, I wanted to talk to you about your favorite food. We are here to get the kids to change the way that they eat, to get them to stop eating things like tortillas or macaroni and cheese and eat things like Brussels sprouts, kale, broccoli, healthy food. So next time, just say you like kale, okay? End quote. Here, Julie Guthman's observations that white-led organizations bring whitened cultural histories to food justice efforts is instructive. It is not only that these efforts lack resonance with those they want to serve, it is also that these efforts undermine different and sometimes competing visions for what it means to live a good or decent life. In an essay on Black study, Darius Carter writes, quote, writing about Blackness can so easily reduce Black people to idealized historical victims whose lives are only as important as their legibility to white audiences, end quote. I'd like to extend Carter's analysis to our food worlds. It is not only writing about Blackness that gets reduced to what is legible to white audiences. It is also programming created for Black people. It is also apparent in addressing inequities that impact Black people. The struggle is present and visible in writing proposals for funding, many of which often require the most radical dreaming to be stripped because it's not measurable, or the granting agency does not quite understand the work at hand. What becomes of food justice if we render struggle and outcomes only to what is legible? As Alison Alcon and Julie Guthman argue in their introduction to the new food activism, the desire to bring good food to predominantly Black communities can quickly reinforce market-driven or neoliberal solutions to problems that were created by the state, giving the government a way out because community organizations take up the burden to provide services and goods to those who need them. To put it another way, neoliberal approaches to food and public health elide a deeper sense and commitment to nourishment that may exceed the biological body. If food justice is a movement, it has to be bigger than access. If access is the center, and if access is our dream, that just makes us better consumers and potentially healthier workers for a capitalist system. It elides the things that make us human. I think perhaps we can dream bigger. I, like many who work in food justice, want some basic life-sustaining things for all Black people and for all people in general. I want no one to go hungry in a world where we produce and waste enough food to efficiently feed the whole planet several times over. I want no one to be deprived of choice. I want no single corporation to have the power to define or influence taste, need, availability, or wages. I want our biological, social, and cultural food needs to be met not with force, but with care. These are not only about what we need, but they are also about what we deserve. When I think about our food futures, I wander through and beyond these basics. The food system and the inequities it produces do more than maintain hierarchies of wealth and taste. They also attempt to steal our imagination and foreclose seeing and dreaming futures beyond restoring what is already rightfully ours. The work of Black people the world over has in part been a work of struggle, wrestling with the state and corporations to, if not protect us, to at least feed us. The work has also been to create and maintain lives through and beyond state and corporate neglect. That work of imagining is what I've been turning to lately. When all people's basic food needs are met, what then? I think about other things. I wonder, how do we take what already exists in fragments, bind them to the ancestral knowledges we carry and skills, stories in our own bodies, and create Black food futures steeped not in struggle, but in delight? What would it look like and feel like to harness the power in Black kitchens and Black neighborhoods, at Black family reunions, and wherever Black people gather to create the conditions for nourishment? So as Nick mentioned, I'm at the University of Texas at Austin. And what he didn't mention, and perhaps maybe doesn't know, is that Texas is my home state. So I now live in Austin, 3 hours west of where I grew up, in a small, rural, unincorporated community that you will likely not find on most maps. On many days when I was growing up, I made a beeline for the garden my grandmother tended in her backyard next door to where I lived. My feet carried me through her front room, kitchen, and then out the back door when I didn't receive an answer when I called her name. And she would most likely be outside, bent over rows of tomatoes, collards, or whatever else she was growing. Sometimes she sang. Most often she was quiet as she coaxed the vegetables from seed to table. My grandmother would probably be known as a recreational gardener these days. She didn't grow all of her own food, but what she did grow, she delighted in. She was of a generation that witnessed firsthand the ravages of tenant farming and sharecropping, her own kin fighting to keep control of our land, part of which my family still owns. She was under no illusions of what it meant to grow her own food or how. She understood her place in a gendered division of labor and how the responsibility for feeding a family was primarily hers, the consequences of not adequately doing so also resting on her shoulders. And yet she, like many others, held on to a promise of growing and preparing food. So for a long time, I lamented not spending more time with her in this garden. She passed away in 2014. Had I done so, I thought I have more skill and more passion to grow my own food. I know now that elder and ancestral knowledges are not linear in the ways that I was thinking. They are passed along through skill, but not only so. They allied one-dimensional time, and thus, when I freed myself of that guilt of not spending more time, it wasn't the planting, it wasn't the harvesting, or even the consumption of what she grew that captures my attention. It was her delight. Black people have always found delight in spite of anti-Blackness and struggle, sometimes right in the very midst of it. I would venture to say that making delight is a spatial project, a method for living in and through persistent anti-Blackness. There is this quote from Zora Neale Hurston's Moses, Man of the Mountain, which is her retelling of the biblical story of Moses through Black vernacular and folklore. These words are a part of this book, and it's one of the most often quoted quotes from one of Zora Neale Hurston's work. See, these words appear after the Egyptians are drowned and the Israelites are ushered into a newfound liberation with song, dance, and glee. Moses, sitting on a boulder apart from the celebration, reflected on how they got there and how his previous crossings had enabled this joyous one. So this most cited quote from Hurston's body of work comes at this point of celebration, this point of reflection, and this point of thinking about what brought them to a particular place. I think of this text in relation to my grandmother and the possibilities we now hold because of ancestors like her who forged spaces for delight and imagination. Food justice is an ancestral project, one through which we hope to map paths to radically different futures. We take what we know, we collectively grapple with what we don't, and we try to create what does not yet exist in a sustainable way. The Hurston quote also brings to mind another scene, a revisiting to one that I wrote about in Black Food Geographies, and I'll share an excerpt here. This is about the community gardens at the public housing complex. The whole area was abuzz. Adults flowed in and out of the kitchen in the community center, huddled together, having conversations in all the available spaces that did not obstruct the walkways. Others rotated between receiving health screenings provided by volunteers from the Student National Medical Association and standing off to the side as if to not fully participate in the activities. About a dozen children worked the garden, pulling weeds, planting new seeds, watering the soil. Others picked up trash and unused gardening materials. The garden itself was composed of only 3 raised beds within a gated area and 2 others that were being constructed outside the gate. Mr. Harris, the primary contact for the garden, was off to the side, cleaning out what he called his experimental bed, where he hoped to try his hand at plants that he had never previously grown. At the heart of this activity was a makeshift dance floor, a grassy space that was taken up by adults from the community and children and students from SNMA. Our hips gyrated as the DJ blasted the wobble. I wish I had played this song for you. We should have played a clip. So the wobble plays. This was a big event for the community and for the garden. Green Space, a local grassroots organization, provided gardening tools and cooking demonstrations throughout the year, and the SNMA partnered with residents to host a community planting day and a health fair. In addition to planting, the physicians in training checked blood pressure, screened for diabetes, and distributed information about health conditions that disproportionately affect African Americans. The grassroots organization supplied the DJ and the food and managed the volunteers who helped with the planting. Attendees ate, participated in screenings, danced, and planted until sunset. The laughter, the food, and good-hearted fellowship overshadowed negative stereotypes associated with public housing, if only for the moment. That day, the crime rates and drug abuse and the reality that this housing project would be torn down hovered in the background as the event, focused on the garden, brought people together for food, fellowship, and fun. What I briefly touched on in that passage and in that chapter was the joy and fun we had while dancing and communing together in the space that that garden provided for us. The garden and the gathering transformed public housing as a site of state neglect into something radically different, something other than the daily violences it encouraged and produced. Perhaps in that stretch of time, the space also changed each of us, bringing new people into new relations with each other and to the land. I'd like to think that if only momentarily, we were, as Sadia Hartman writes, creating other arrangements of what is possible. Marcus Hunter and Zandria Robinson write in their book, Chocolate Cities, quote, that the map of Black American life is also created by the aspirations and dreams, some realized, others not, of Black migrations, end quote. The ebb and flow of people moving in and out of not only that particular space, but DC more broadly, and the diasporic knowledges sown into the soil and community provided another way to see and engage spaces that are largely characterized by their lack. The very neighborhoods and cities we look to work within to address food access or food insecurity are not only the product of inequity, they are also sites for aspiration and dreaming. So we might ask, when we view the sites where we work from that perspective, how does that shift our understanding of food justice? Perhaps 2 different but also related questions. How do we move to a place and a time where all people's food needs are met not with force, but with care, and where we anticipate and create the conditions for delight? One way that I have sought to explore these questions is through the work of Black studies scholars who take up imagination, pleasure, and joy as theoretical and embodied frameworks through which to understand Black life. This work is not to eschew, ignore, or excuse anti-Black violence. Instead, it reminds, demands, and declares that Black life cannot be reduced to only that of violence. As Christina Sharp writes, quote, "While we are constituted through and by continued vulnerability to this overwhelming force of anti-Blackness, we are not only known to ourselves or to each other by that force," end quote. How else might we know, and how else might we be known? In Freedom Dreams, Robin D.G. Kelly writes that we must tap into the well of our own collective imaginations, that we do what earlier generations have already done. We dream. And we must do this because, quote, "without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us," end quote. The map to the new world, Kelly writes, is in the imagination. In his work on the Black radical tradition more broadly, Kelly points to Black social movements as case studies in the development of freedom dreams over time, pushing back against the binary framing of success and failure as the only measures of those dreams and movements. Through organizing, art, poetry, music, and deep study, Black communities have dreamt of new lands, new ways of relating socially and economically, and new freedoms. This radical imagination, as Ashan Crawley writes, is not separate from violence. It is produced and enacted as a practice right in the midst of it. Building on the work of Leanne Simpson that argues that what we continue is what we've already done, Crawley writes, "To do what we have already done is to mark the fact that otherwise possibility is not tending toward a future that is to come, but it is the marking of the practices that we have and do and carry with care and love for one another against the imposition of settler colonial violence, the violence that is co-articulated with anti-Blackness to produce the modern crisis of racialization, the theft of ground and air, and the strangulation of life possibilities." Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it this way, quote, "What the world will become already exists in fragments and pieces, in experiments and possibilities," end quote. These fragments, pieces, experiments, and possibilities are sometimes necessarily improvised and provisional. Catherine McKittrick argues that they are also imprecise and unrealized. Here, I want to remark upon this imprecision, because that seems antithetical to much of social science research, antithetical to programming that requires measurable outcomes, antithetical to how justice gets reduced to facts and numbers. And it is that imprecision that reminds us of Black life and Black living as connected but not reducible to feeding, managing, disciplining, tending, or healing Black bodies. The forms of creative labor that undergird Blackness, labor that include cooking and feeding, are imprecise in part because of the ways anti-Blackness requires forms of navigating that demand a steady improvising. And how does one measure improvisation? How do we even begin to measure the beauty in these methods for living? So here I want to return to the concept of delight. Let me skip ahead. Here we go. So this is a photo of my mother's hands. She is making tea cakes, a Southern delicacy that, for those of you who do not know it, I'm assuming most of you maybe don't, it's kind of like a shortbread cookie, but maybe much better than a shortbread cookie. In my opinion, it's definitely better than a shortbread cookie. Undoubtedly, it is their sweetness and Black Southerners' affection for them that had to at least be in part of the reason why Zora Neale Hurston chose to name Janie's love interest after them in Their Eyes Were Watching God. They're sweet, they're delicious, they're a must-have, and they're also a lifeline between my mother and me. I am Southern born, raised in what some would call a working class family, though that designation is complicated in the rural South. When I went off to college and then off to teach and then again to a PhD, I traversed many different environments, collecting social and cultural capital along the way. These tea cakes, or rather my mother's preparation of them, kept us tethered through every move I made, through my stints with veganism, through the class straddling that my work and my life require. When I was away, my mother would mail them to me and my friends, a form of labor that I associate with love and care. On the day that I took this photo in 2017, I was home for the holidays visiting her. And I was watching her make these tea cakes for me and watching her delight in making these tea cakes for me, an offering of sorts. I didn't need these cookies, not in terms of biology. In fact, depending on who you ask, they might be considered antithetical to the work that I do in food justice, because really I cannot call them a healthy food at all. But I needed them otherwise, for what they expressed in terms of care and affection, and for what they offer my mother and me in a way that only food can, a point of connection. This kind of practice is one that undergirds my life. In fact, I would say it's a kind of practice that undergirds most Black lives. This kind of practice is what makes my life possible. It is this everyday, perhaps mundane practice where I first learned that freedom happens at multiple scales, that what one makes in the kitchen offers lessons for how to live, how to love, fight, create, and be in the weather of anti-Blackness. In my mother's kitchen, I learned that to imagine is not always fantastical, or to dream of faraway lands or places or forms of freedom that are not already present. Sometimes imagination looks like improvising. Sometimes it looks like baking tea cakes for your ambitious girl child who is navigating anti-Blackness and patriarchy in cities far enough away that you cannot reach out and grab her. Sometimes imagination looks like carving a small path through the wake. This is what I learned from Christina Sharp when she writes, "Beauty is a method." Sharp writes that her mother's attentiveness to a Black aesthetic made her and moved her, quote, "from the windowsill to the world," end quote. This resonates with me for many reasons, but perhaps one that is relevant for our conversation is that that movement from the windowsill to the world is a literal movement. In writing about beauty as method, Sharp helps us to see how her mother's practices of making beauty, despite crumbling infrastructure, despite anti-Blackness, is a spatial process that connects aesthetics, curiosity, and taste to movement. Beauty itself is a catalyst. If we consider delight or the practices of delight a form of beauty, how might we reimagine how we think about, witness, and advocate for Black people and food? Nick mentioned this in the introduction, and some of you may have already been aware, I'm working on a new project that in part takes up sugar and carcerality. For the purposes of this talk, I won't offer too many details, but the project takes up Catherine McKittrick's assertion that spaces of anti-Black violence are also, quote, spaces of encounter that hold in them useful anti-colonial practices and narratives, end quote. I've been thinking and writing through a curiosity that I've had for many years, which is the way sugar gets framed and discussed in discourses about health and healthiness, specifically how sugar takes on a carceral function in relation to Black people. But to do this project well, I've had to think too about a distinction between sugar as a product of racial capitalism and sweetness as a necessary component for Black life. In a salon honoring In the Wake on Blackness and Being, Saidiya Hartman remarked that care is the antidote to violence. And in my current work, I'm thinking about how this phrase holds up when we think about sweetness as an antidote to violence. This distinction between sugar and sweetness, particularly how sweetness gets deployed in service to and not against Black life, delight, and joy, is where I see decolonial possibilities. As part of this project, I bake. My baking is guided by the questions: what can recipes and baking teach us about embodying an abolitionist praxis in pursuit of food justice? What can they teach us about how to live in the wake of slavery? What can it teach us about inhabiting and rupturing the epistemes with our knowable, these violent epistemes with our knowable lives? In doing these baking experiments, I employ what Anand Pandian articulates as the aspirational work of an anthropology that is both empirical and highly speculative, attacking between close attention to what is and sweeping imagination of what else might also be. And perhaps in the process, I'm creating some space for working with and thinking about Vertime Grosvenor's vibration cooking as not just a method for preparing food, but also a lesson, an epistemology of Black improvisation and world making. So this short video is me playing with dough. I'm making tea cakes like my mother. And like my mother, I am making them as an offering. But my offering isn't for the living, it is for the dead. Using a recipe from Imperial Sugar Company's 1920s cookbook, one that I altered a bit to work with the concept of improvisation, and sugar made by that same company, I made these tea cakes for an altar I constructed for the remains of 95 people who were unearthed in Sugar Land, Texas in 2018. When they were living, they would have done agricultural labor under the surveillance of the Texas penitentiary system, most of them planting, harvesting, and hauling sugarcane in Southeast Texas. A few worked directly for Imperial Sugar Company, the company around which the now flourishing Houston suburb was built. This baking was my first of what may be many embodied experiments in exploring sweetness in an anti-Black world. So for this particular one, I set out what I needed: flour, buttermilk, imperial sugar, vanilla extract, butter, and an egg. Measuring cups, mixing bowl, and a hand mixer, double checking to make sure I had everything. I was nervous. Though many people had taken up baking as a way to work through pandemic anxieties, I am not one of them. In fact, I bake very little. I was making these tea cakes to add to an altar, but I was nervous about the offering. I had never built an altar to ancestors who were not in my direct lineage. It wasn't until I had pulled out all of the ingredients, lining them up in the counter in such a way that I could clearly see Imperial's signature dark blue crown stamped on the packaging, that I realized I had not decided where I would roll out this dough. And that realization generated another. I also hadn't thought about how I would roll out the dough. And as is such, when I'm cooking, it happens often, my mind drifted back home, back to where I grew up, to the place where I daydreamed about Houston and its suburbs like Sugar Land, thinking they were the big city. They were places where one's life could really be lived, not the place where I grew up. I didn't know then that we all, city and rural folk alike, live in the long shadow of the plantation's hold on shaping Black life. And so now, 3 hours away, I live this life of the mind. I read, I study, I research, I teach. Sometimes that work keeps me from other things like cooking and exercising or making space for play. But growing up, the rhythm was different and improvisation governed our lives. But these thoughts about the where and the how awakened memories in my own body. My grandmother and my mother used their countertops as workspace for rolling out dough. My grandmother rolled the dough with a mason jar or glass instead of a rolling pin, even though she always had one handy. Each memory wove a thread between the past and the present. And when I shared the memory with a friend, she remarked, "Yeah, my mom does that too. She says it rolls better that way." These Black mothers across space and time made use of everyday materials to bring forth sweetness. And so I decided that I would do the same. The recipe written by a Mrs. Jones is quite simple. 3 cups of flour, 1 egg, 1 heaping teaspoon of baking powder, 1 cup of imperial sugar, a scant half a cup of buttermilk, 3/4 cup of butter, 1 level teaspoon of baking soda, sifted fine, half teaspoon of salt, flavor to taste. I almost missed that flavor to taste meant baker's choice for how much vanilla extract to use. Reading the recipe through a second or third time reminded me that my grandmother always called vanilla extract flavoring. When Mrs. Jones wrote flavor to taste in her recipe, she extended an invitation to me across space and time to experiment and to trust my own tastes. I don't remember how much vanilla extract I added, and perhaps that is part of the experimentation too. Letting every time be a little different, letting the day, the circumstances, the needs inform the decision. That small detail reminds me that I am still in the land of the living. Memories, fragmented thoughts of making ways out of no way, appreciation for ingenuity and care, and then questions. If food justice is reframed through a lens of experimentation and delight, what might we learn about freedom? What I've been gesturing to in this talk, but have not quite named because it's still something that I'm reconciling in my own brain, is that my rethinking and rewriting and rereading has brought me to this. To rethink or to abandon access as a frame, we also have to give considerable thought to what we mean by self-determination. I am wondering, can we conceptualize Black self-determination in a way that is de-linked from, or at least not primarily thought through, a framework of labor? I follow a lot of amazing, radical, Black-led food justice organizations and farmers. These organizations and farmers labor tirelessly on behalf of Black people, working toward a liberation that extends well beyond what food is on a person's plate. And one thing that most, if not all of these organizations and farmers have in common is that this work is exhausting. And often their labor is underpaid or undervalued. As they work to create alternatives to state abandonment, I wonder, how do beauty and delight fit in with duty and responsibility? These are the things that I am still thinking through. I believe that all Black people will have the necessities that I mentioned earlier. And when we do, I wonder if we're ready to create food spaces that build on the best of our lineages and practices rather than the worst that reproduce inequities. What futures do the eggs produced by our ancestors hold? What past lessons and experiences and delights have prepared us for food futures that are not only defined by struggle, but by delight itself? In the food futures that I see, we draw on the creativity and the ingenuity that have sustained Black lives through colonialism, enslavement, theft of land and body, and over-policing. And the food futures I look forward to, our food lives are not measured by prescriptive outputs or constrained by or through policy. Instead, we build on pasts and the present to give our food and our communities a future in which we have space and time to delight in feeding ourselves and each other. A future in which holistic nourishment is the goal to which we hold ourselves accountable. We are creating these already. They exist in fragments, in possibilities, in experimentations, in moments of delight. They exist in gardens, in farms, in meals. I guess what I'm suggesting here is that maybe we could tarry there and think about how what we already know, what we already have access to, and the Black lives that teach us, how they might give our food lives a very different future. Thank you. Oh, I can't hear you. Oh, there you go.
Yes. Thank you so much. A beautiful, mind-opening talk, and I think many of the viewers are also impressed. I want to invite those of you to who have questions or comments to put them in the chat and send them, and we'll turn to that in just a moment. And maybe to get us started, I'll ask you a question.
Okay.
And I spent almost a decade working in New York City jails around well-being and reentry. And it's, as you know, a very fraught, tough environment, and the people who are incarcerated face very tough lives. I was interested in your work in the, with Texas prisons, and I wonder if you're ready to say something, and the notion of bringing delight to that setting.
Yeah.
How do you think about that? And are there concrete thoughts you have of bringing delight into a setting like that, or into other settings where Black food movements are working today in very fraught environments?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. And one thing that has been beautiful to watch over the last couple of years is this emerging interest of food and carcerality, and what's happening at the intersection of food and carcerality. And so Josh Spica, who wrote the book Food Justice Now, and I have co-edited a special issue of Food and Food Waste that is under review right now and hopefully will be out sometime next year on food and carcerality. And so we've brought together people who are working across different spaces. So I actually want to use this time to talk about some of the work that might be featured in that special issue. So Dr. Annalena Hope Hasberg has been doing some incredible work on the West Coast with thinking through a restorative justice frame for reentry and how food and farming might fit into that work. And one of the things that I really appreciate about this work that she's doing is she's been thinking a lot about the connection between food and the breath and meditation, not just like meditation, the practice, but food as a form of meditation and this kind of healing practice. So that's work I would point people to. Josh Spica is doing this, what I consider an enormously important project with trying to parcel out the different forms of agriculture that takes place currently in prisons, the kind of massive agribusiness stuff like that happens in Texas, but also smaller projects like gardens that are tended or herb gardens and such. And I think why I think that's important is because when we think about violence, and if we use this frame that I've been repeating over and over, that violence isn't the only way to know Black lives, then I think we might think of these smaller spaces like gardens and prisons as both being carceral, but also a space where people practice forms of freedom and liberation. And so in my own work that may or may not show up in this book, probably won't show up in the book, but may show up in an article form. In Texas, there are these several of the 54, there are 54 state prisons in Texas. Several of them include small herb gardens. And there's this network of competitions where different prison units enter their herb gardens into this kind of competition, and people take a lot of pride into it. They get really excited. They're judged on the beauty of the garden, and they're judged on the variety of these small gardens. And so I want to examine that a little bit more. The last thing I would say is there's a lot of ingenuity in cooking in prisons. And so there's a body of literature that looks at recipes, prison implements to cook within the cells. And I think that's a really important site to consider, right? Like I'm talking about improvisation and I'm using my fully stocked kitchen. It's a whole other thing to improvise when you're making do with whatever you have access within a prison setting. So yeah, and also for those of you who are interested in food, for the Association for the Study of Food and Society, there'll be both a panel and a roundtable discussion on food and carcerality. So that's a plug for the June conference.
Great. I heard on the radio just the other day an interview with one of the guys who spent, I think, 15 years at Guantanamo and was then released. And he described a series of workshops, support sessions they did, where the guys from 40 different countries who were held in Guantanamo got together and in their imagination cooked a meal together. Listing every ingredient, chopping up together in imagination the onions and the spices, pretending to burn their hands, to have the sensations. It was just such a moving description.
What you were just saying, Nick, actually it sounded beautifully to me, and I had smiled, and then I was also having this internal moment where I was like, oh, and this is also happening in a setting where translating imagination to doing is not possible. And so what I want to connect to with that is when we know food is a sensory experience, we know that it's embodied experience, we know it's labored with culture and memory and all of these different things. And I guess the question I would pose to anyone who is doing food justice work is, why would we not include that in our framings of justice? That people have access to both the things to produce this delight that is connected to memory and social and cultural history, but also to have the space to create it, right? So yeah, thank you for your comment. It just reminded me of just how important it is to think beyond just, I want people to be healthy, right? But like giving space for people to define what that means for themselves might also mean that we give space for people to create meals and such that might not fit within dietary guidelines.
Right. A question from my colleague, Jen Papandik, who has done work on school food for many years. And she asks you, delight is not often associated with school cafeterias. And she wonders if you have any thoughts on how to grow delight in school food programs.
Oh, that's a good question. Thank you for the question. So I'm going to be that person who answers the question with a story. So I mentioned I taught middle school, and one of the things that I did in 7th grade, we were learning about civil disobedience. And I've said this in other spaces where sometimes theory doesn't make sense until I put it into practice. And that's very much how I teach. So I asked my students, if we were going to design a form of civil disobedience, what would it be around? And we did this whole survey across all of my classes. And the common complaint was about the cafeteria. So then I was like, okay, cool. We just did this design. That was great. And they're like, so are we going to boycott the cafeteria? Are we going to do this now? And I was like, oh, well, maybe. So I said, I gave them one rule. I was like, we can do this. We can set up, we can boycott, we can do some kind of like political education. We can do some kind of sit-in, but my only rule is that no one can go hungry. So, I taught in a high need school that people might think that would be a barrier to students organizing. And when I tell you, these students would bring like extra sandwiches from home for their colleagues, for their classmates. They would share, it is still one of my favorite moments from middle school teaching, because not only did they feel empowered, they did the care work. It wasn't just that people were caring for them, they were caring for each other. And ultimately, the end of the story, besides me, the principal threatening to get me fired, was that the students were able to advocate for like a salad bar and some other options for their cafeteria. And I have never seen 12 and 13-year-olds be so excited about what they were learning in the classroom and how that impacted their actual everyday material lives. So I just say that to say that, I think one of the things about delight and school settings is that it can't be something that we just dreamed up and put in a lesson plan. That's exactly what I learned, right? I dreamed up and put in a lesson plan. And what my students wanted was something more. They wanted me to also trust them with something more. So I know that's not necessarily a straightforward answer, but I often think about how little school age children are trusted to think and design and care and to work through very difficult things on their own behalf.
So there's a comment in the chat from Rebecca Johnson. Thank you, Rebecca, that I think amplifies your comment. Rebecca writes, I experienced that in a recent class. Students did not have salt, measuring cups, or rolling pins. They were visibly feeling out of sync until I shared how fancy equipment and ingredients were not necessary. It was their confidence, she writes, that I thankfully understood was at stake more than the pizza dough they were making.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that piece. And it just makes me think about how, if we extrapolate that to the work that we do in communities, however you define communities, that what's at stake is almost always probably bigger than what we think is at stake, right? Like the object that we're working with, there's the object, and then there's our feelings and meanings attached to the object. And I think that is the work and possibly the challenge of thinking through food justice beyond access, is that it's easy to identify the object, the meanings and the attachments that we have to the object, whatever the food object may be. That's a little bit more slippery. That's a little less easy to quantify. And that is where relationships are built. And I think the kind of relational aspect is super important.
Thank you. This was amazing. I have to tell you, I'm just so moved by this. Thank you for what you're doing.
So there's a couple more questions in a slightly different direction about USDA and the new Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. And one question asks if what your thoughts are on the recent initiatives to provide a higher level of support for Black farmers? And what do you think are the potential and limits of those new moves on the part of USDA? And the second is another question about one of Tom Vilsack's new initiatives. He's talking about moving from hunger relief to relief of nutrition insecurity, saying the problem is not just hunger and food insecurity, but nutrition insecurity. And I wonder, again, what you think are the potential and limits of that framing for addressing the issues facing Black communities around food.
Yeah, those are big questions. And this is being recorded, so I will think carefully about how I'm gonna. So I'll say this about the USDA and some of the kind of new moves that are happening. I just want to shout out the Black organizers and farmers that have been at the table to think through some things that might be supportive for Black farmers. I think the USDA has caused so much harm that there is no one policy, or even, I don't even know that there are any number of policies that the USDA can enact that would provide enough reparations for that harm. However, I do think having the kinds of organizers and farmers at the table who contributed to the bill for Black farmers, for example, was really important, has been a really important move. And I think being connected to some of those people, I'm really proud of the kind of thought and work that they put into that. This move from hunger relief to nutrition insecurity, I'm gonna think about this a little bit more. But my first thought is to think that sometimes specificity does not work in our favor. Sometimes specificity also can become a form of policing. And so when I hear the phrase nutritional insecurity, A, I'm thinking about how do we define that? And then B, I'm thinking about what forms of funding, what does that look like in terms of like not just the funding, but the kinds of restrictions that might put on how people use SNAP benefits, for example, and such. So I don't know, these are two big questions that I should spend more time thinking about, but I also think that these questions are a question of scale. I'm always thinking about scale and the multiple scales at which things are happening. And so, you know, we've got this larger macro scale. And so my question kind of brings it down. And for me, I'm always thinking about, okay, how does this trickle down to everyday life? So I'd be curious to think more about what a nutritional insecurity framework does for actual real people. Because I think in this country, we love to police poor people. And so it's hard for me to not think about this as another way to police poor people.
Yep, and ending up with victim blaming solutions rather than liberating solutions. I'm going to read you two questions from the chat. I think you'll be able to see them yourself. I'll read them and then give you a chance to decide how you want to answer them. This is from Brooke Rawson, who said, appreciate your point about how government organizations often do not for intangibles from their perspective, like delight. And have you or others found a way to overcome this? And how do we weave these concepts into our work more often? The second question from Susan Jakubowski says, this talk has changed my perspective in a good way. That's what we always hope for talks. What would you recommend for food program graduates? What advice do you have for students who are going into this work?
Advice. I like giving out advice. I'm a Capricorn, so I like telling people what to do. So Susan, now I got advice. But the first question around funding, yeah, this is a tough one, right? Like I wished, this is one of those moments where I'm like, wow, like I'm still an outsider in this conversation. So I want to tread a little bit like in terms of I don't work for organizations. I just kind of observe what people are doing or not doing. I think some of my favorite organizations to watch, like Soul Fire Farm, the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, with whom I work with sometimes, and the Buffalo Food Equity Network. These are ones that come to mind for me right off the top. What I love about them is that the work to think about funding happens well before funding. And what I mean by that is in their organizational structures. So I think part of what is required is thinking through the outcomes, but also who and what is the organization accountable to? So when I think about the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, they consider themselves accountable to their members. And so I think that kind of structure necessarily dictates the kind of funding that they would go after and the kind of funding that they are willing to take. And not only are they willing to take, they have very clear guidelines internally around what they're willing to do and what they're not willing to do. And somehow that has paid off for them quite well in terms of an organization and a network of organizations. So I would say it's really tricky, right? Like on the other hand, I just gave you those three examples, and I'm thinking about organizations that are less resourced because they don't have the staff, for example, to do the what I think of as tally taking, right? Like to keep up with all the measurements that are supposed to go back to the funders. So I don't have any concrete advice other than to just affirm that I think this is a real problem. But I also think it's not just a problem of like organizations. This is what it means for something to move into the mainstream, though. This is what it means for neoliberalism to be the kind of overarching frame within which we're doing the work, which means that large foundations get to have an incredible amount of say in where millions of dollars is going, and who's and not just where the funding is going. By dictating where the funding is going, they're also fundamentally shaping a food justice landscape, because who gets funded does the work. So I don't know. Oh, Susan's question about advice and graduate programs. So I was on a panel about like food systems education recently. And one of the things that I remember from that conversation is thinking about how narrowly we define sustainability. And so I think my first piece of advice would be, I wonder like what a class would look like that was just about the concept, like the concept of sustainability, both like, you know, sustainable farming practices, but also, I mean, I mentioned this in the talk, like what does it mean to sustain actual lives, right? Like this network of sustainability, I think is really interesting. But how it gets, I think people often think that way, but how the language of sustainability gets deployed, I think kind of loses some of those levels. So I think that's part of it. I think there's a lot of really great work in food systems right now around racism in the food system. With my colleague here at UT Austin, her name is Hiile Hobart, and she does Indigenous food studies. We've been thinking quite a bit around like, okay, at this point, how do we bring Black food geographies, Indigenous food geographies, Latinx food geography, how do we bring these into conversation that do not elide difference, because there are very real differences and distinctions, but to think about coalition building. I personally think that any critical food studies program at this point should be thinking about that. How do you train students to think relationally across lines of difference? I think one of the enduring problems of advocacy work in particular is that the savior complex just keeps reproducing itself no matter how much we try to kill it. And so I also wonder what it looks like to train students from the very beginning to not think that the work that they're doing is to save somebody, is to save a community, because that is not the work. So, and in fact, like, I don't teach a grad class in food studies right now, but with my undergrad class, we start very early with like thinking through how to unlearn that framework, how to unlearn and I want to emphasize we have to unlearn. It's not a thing that I can just teach. There's a whole lot of unlearning that has to come with that, whether it's a white savior complex or like a class thing. There's an unlearning process for all of us. So I would build that into my food systems teaching and program. Oh, I think who you teach matters. So, and I don't think this is just about citational politics. I think there are really radically different approaches to food justice and critical food studies. And I can almost always tell whose work is kind of, and this doesn't make it necessarily bad, but whose work is, if we did this, if this project were successful and we just got enough food on people's table, then that would be enough. That's a different kind of work than thinking through a liberation framework, which is work that I kind of now think through. And what we write about in the introduction in Black Food Matters is that why this matters isn't just about who's at the table, although I guess that has some measure of importance, but there are very real Black epistemologies. There are Black ways of knowing and being that inform politics, that inform programming and such. And so I think who you teach matters. And I don't just mean books. I also mean, like, are there ways to incorporate community programming into a program, et cetera, et cetera?
So, and I would also say, and who's in your classroom, right? Who are the students who you admit and give access to? And that is at the core of City University of New York, that is a historic mission. And we're a school of public health where a majority of our students are people of color, and we think that's right. I'm going to ask you a closing question, which again takes your willingness to give us some thoughts on this. And it's similar to the question that was just asked, but speaking now from our location within the world of public health, as public health professionals, public health students, public health researchers, and in both the food policy institute that my colleagues and I work in, and in the School of Public Health as a large, we're thinking a lot these days about how do we take on systemic racism? How do we take on its role in creating and maintaining inequities in health? And I wonder if in your closing thoughts to us, you could say, as an educator not in public health, but in related fields, what do you think is the role of food in particular in enabling people in public health to think in new and different ways about racism and our role in dismantling racism and its impact on health?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big question. That's a good question to end on because it's a big one. I thought I would work in public health for a very long time. Like, I went to graduate school. I had no intentions of going into the academy. I did all this work outside of the academy, and then I ended up back here. That's a longish story. But when I was doing some research in a school of public health while I was still a graduate student, one of the things that was so difficult for me was the prescriptive nature through which I was being trained to think about the work that we were doing. And I remember talking to my advisor on this project at the time. I was like, I have lots of questions. And I'm asking all these questions. And one of the things that he kind of shook his head at me and said was, you have a lot of questions. They are important and they do not fit within this framework that we are trying to do this project. And so I guess my first thought would be that food, if we allow it to, I don't think it is automatically this way, but I do think food has a way to help us think interdisciplinarily and across boundaries and across disciplines. And for whatever reason, it feels more accessible than some other things, right? There are a lot of writings across, like, for example, I could write about diabetes, which was initially a project that I was working on in grad school. But somehow writing about that as an anthropologist outside of a school of public health or outside of a medical school, et cetera, feels like there's some barriers to how I would be able to talk across these different fields, right? And I know, Nick, I mentioned this to you, that I don't often get invited to schools of public health, which is, I think is an important thing to note here, right? Which is to say that, like, even as someone who's writing about food, perhaps also this addition of thinking about anti-Black racism becomes one of those things that shuts people down. I think in a school of public health and thinking, I think the biggest thing, like I mentioned in the talk, is how do we think about food's relationship to the body, but not solely to the body? To how do we think about food's relationship to one's entire being? And I will say that in this project where I'm doing this baking and all these different things, there are moments where I feel my social science training telling me this is not real research. And I think that that is a message that sometimes people get in public health when things, again, are not super measurable or do not fit into a certain framework. And so even this project, even though, like, I'm an anthropologist, so that, you know, there's this intersection, I'm not the hardcore social scientist, but there's still this way that I am having to talk to this critic in my head that says, this is not real. This is not data. This is not important. And I think I wonder what playing with that critic looks like for someone who's in public health. I don't know if I have more thoughts about this. I'm still thinking. I'm also, my first thought too was, I wonder what it means to think about systematic racism and anti-Blackness as a frame. But I also wonder what it looks like to train students or be someone who's thinking about food through the lens of nourishment and sustaining Black life, so that anti-Black racism becomes the context or the weather, like Christina Sharp writes about, but the focus becomes sustaining Black life.
So I think this might be a good time to end. Professor Reese, thank you so much. A wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Really expanding our minds, and we thank you for coming and joining us, and we thank you all for your questions, comments, and participation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for showing up. I really appreciate you being here.
Good. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.